In the famous 1938 Avro tournament, Mikhail Botvinnik, who would later become a three-time world champion and the patriarch of Soviet chess, as well as a mentor to future legends such as Garry Kasparov, was facing, at that moment, the ultimate test. He had to face none other than the former world champion and Cuban genius, José Raúl Capablanca. In a duel that became, as this chess-based article points out, one of the most famous games in chess history, and one that forms part of every player's education. And that is exactly what we are going to relive today in this video. 27-year-old Mikhail Botvinnik has the white pieces and opens with 1d4. José Raúl Capablanca, who had just celebrated his 50th birthday and was no longer in the years of his greatest chess strength, has the black pieces and replies with knight f6. White advances in the center with c4, and black responds with e6, with the idea that once the knight develops to c3, the bishop will move to b4 and pin it. Thus, Capablanca sets up a Nimzo-Indian defense, something that was becoming very fashionable in those years. To face this defense, Botvinnik responds by advancing the pawn to e3, entering what is known as the Rubinstein variation of the Nimzo-Indian. Now, before we continue, let me point out something important. When Mikhail Botvinnik studied openings, he did so through pawn structures. For example, let us take a look at this important pawn structure we have in the position. And now, let us also look at this old photograph showing Botvinnik himself teaching it to a young Kasparov many years later. That approach allowed players to master the plans, the tactical ideas, and the middle game subtleties that arise from this type of structure. And in this particular pawn structure, there is a very dangerous attacking plan available for white. We will see it later. For the moment, Capablanca responds in the center with c5. Then Botvinnik plays a3, and black replies by capturing the knight, damaging the pawn structure of the opponent. Now, when facing this pawn structure with white's doubled pawn, I would undoubtedly prefer, after some preparation, to place the pawn on d6 and later advance the other to e5, creating this triangle of pawns, a plan frequently used, for example, by Anatoly Karpov. But in this case, Capablanca decides to advance the pawn directly to d5. A line that can certainly be played, but which, personally, is not the one I like the most. And why is this variation not entirely to my taste? Well, because it allows white to immediately free themselves from their weakness by capturing on d5. Now Botvinnik has the bishop pair and no longer has to deal with any doubled pawns. Naturally, Capablanca has to do something about this, but for the moment it is white to move, and the bishop is developed to d3, black castles, and the knight develops to e2. This last move is a key part of white's plan. We will see later why it is so important. For now, Capablanca continues with b6, with the idea that once Botvinnik castles, he can develop the bishop to a6 in order to exchange this important piece and, in that way, neutralize white's bishop pair. Botvinnik does not find a better solution and decides to exchange bishops, with the idea that when the knight recaptures, it will end up somewhat awkwardly placed on that square. Now the game continues with bishop b2. At first glance, this may look a bit strange because the bishop is running directly into its own pawn chain. However, the simple idea for white is that in some positions, and at the right moment, they may be able to play c4 and completely open up the diagonal for the bishop. We will soon see whether that plan actually works, because Capablanca first continued with queen d7, with the intention that, if the queen moves away, black can infiltrate through the light squares on this side of the board, which have been weakened after the exchange of bishops. Botvinnik, of course, does not want to allow that, and that is why he advances the pawn to a4, shutting down that possibility. The game continues with the rook moving to e8 and the queen developing to d3, attacking the knight on a6. And so we reach the most important and critical moment from a positional point of view in the entire game. Let us break it down step by step. The healthiest move in this position was to defend the knight on a6 by moving the queen to b7, maintaining the central tension, that is, always keeping the possibility that the center might open. But nearly 100 years ago, it was impossible for Capablanca to have such a difficult evaluation fully clear. So he continues in what seems to be the most logical way, advancing the pawn to c4, gaining a tempo and attacking the queen, which retreats to c2. And everything seems to favor black, because the square b3 has also been gained for the knight, which can now head there along this route. We can also see how this bishop has been affected. As we said, at first glance, everything appears to favor black. However, this move has a very serious problem. It weakens the king, something that Botvinnik already understood very clearly at that time, perhaps better than anyone. But wait a moment, why does this move weaken the black king? Well, because when the center closes, attacks on the flanks gain enormous strength. And if we count the pawns in this sector, we will notice something important. White has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pawns against black's 4. In other words, White has an extra soldier in that sector to launch the offensive, and that means that from now on, the king will be exposed to a dangerous attack. Kasparov explains it this way in his book. Capablanca's decision has a clear historical motive. Throughout his long career, he had never encountered the concept of latent dynamic factors, and his unique intuition and wealth of experience misfired, failing to send a signal about the danger of the resulting position. Let us see what happens next. The game continues with black retreating the knight to b8, so that, as we mentioned earlier, it can head for b3. The rook moves to e1, concentrating its forces on the kingside. Capablanca now develops his knight to c6, and for his part, the white knight is repositioned to g3, so that after black continues with the plan of moving this piece to a5, Botvinnik can then advance the pawn to f3 and begin the expansion in the center and the attack on the kingside. That is why developing the knight to e2 was so important, rather than to the other square. And now let me show you something else. Let us look at the formation of White's pieces. And now let us look at this diagram. It belongs to a game played by Kasparov many years later. Notice that the piece formation is practically the same. Surely, the ogre of Baku learned it from the old patriarch. Returning to the game, Capablanca continued with his plan, bringing the knight to b3. Then White's center began to move with e4. Black decided to capture the pawn on a4, with the idea that if the kingside attack did not end up working, they would at least have enough counterplay thanks to this passed pawn. Kasparov comments, "This rather pitiful pawn has played the important role of bait for the tiger." White's attack continues with great force by advancing to e5, attacking the knight, which retreats to d7. Botvinnik could already continue his advance with f4, but first, he decides to bring the queen to the kingside, moving it to f2. In any case, the storm clouds are gathering over the black king. Capablanca, for his part, tries to slow down the attack by playing g6, with the idea that when White plays f4 and strongly threatens to continue with f5, he will be able to advance the pawn to that square and try to contain the offensive. However, Botvinnik responds by capturing en passant, with a very clear intention, to open lines against the black king, because after the knight recaptures, the breaks on the kingside will continue with f5. Now, whenever Capablanca felt in danger, he often tried to defend himself with a resource that saved him in many games, immediately exchanging as many pieces as possible. That is why he continues by exchanging the rook, with the idea that when the white rook recaptures, he can bring the other rook to e8 and keep simplifying the position. Now we reach a very important moment, a thematic move that appears in many positions. How should White continue here? Capture the rook immediately? Well, that could be an option, but it is much stronger to play rook to e6, an excellent move. Notice that the analysis engine shows it as the only winning move. The knight on f6 is under attack, and the idea is that if the rook is captured, White will recapture. Then this pawn becomes a powerful passed pawn, a very dangerous and fundamental element in the attack against the black king. Now the knight on f6 is also under attack from the queen, so the king moves to g7 to defend it. Then the queen moves to f4, trying to infiltrate along this diagonal. Black, with very good judgment, decides to quickly bring the queen back to the defense by moving it to e8. White could give check on c7, but it is much stronger to centralize the queen on e5, defending the pawn at the same time while pinning the enemy knight on f6. After this, Capablanca continued with queen e7, blocking the advance of the pawn. And so we arrive at the most important and crucial tactical moment of the entire game. This position appears in many books, accompanied by the instruction, White to move and win. If you want, you can pause the video and try to find the same move played by the 6th world champion. And if you did, I hope you found it, because Botvinnik continued with the powerful move bishop to a3. 2 exclamation marks for this move because of all the history behind it, and because the analysis engine confirms that it is the strongest move in the position. Today, this move is an icon of chess. Botvinnik himself even recounts that during the World Olympiad in 1954 in Amsterdam, this famous position was depicted on an enormous cake, displayed in the window of one of the central confectionery shops. The idea is simple but powerful. Botvinnik understands perfectly that as long as the black queen remains close to the king, it will be very difficult to finish the attack. That is why he finds this brilliant maneuver. He sacrifices this bishop, which until that moment had not been performing any important function, so that after it is captured, the queen will be lured away from the king and from the defense. But wait a moment, because things are not so simple. From here on, White must continue with enormous precision, and Botvinnik does so by now jumping with the knight to h5, another very strong move. Notice that the knight on f6 cannot capture because it is pinned. And if the king moves, then that knight on f6 will be captured, and black's position would become even worse. Therefore, the best option for Capablanca is to accept the challenge and capture the knight, but with the pawn. After this, the queen gives check on g5. The king has only these 2 squares. Trying to hide in the corner would not save him, so he moves to f8. But then White captures the knight on f6 anyway, with check. Now, if the king were to move to e8, then queen f7 would follow, then king d8, and queen d7 checkmate. That is why, and let us go back for a moment, the king cannot escape toward the queen side and must return to the king side, after which the pawn advances decisively to e7, threatening to promote, and also supporting the mate with queen f8. For Capablanca, there is no longer any salvation. His only resource is to try to give a series of checks to the white king, beginning with queen c1. Botvinnik later commented that he could not calculate the entire variation to the very end, but his analysis told him that White's 2 main threats could not be stopped, and that his king would find a safe refuge from the checks. Let us see what happens. First, the king moves to f2. The queen checks again on c2. Then the king advances to g3, and the checks continue with queen d3. The king keeps marching to h4. Another check follows on this square, and this time the king captures the pawn on h5. After this, the queen checks again by moving to e2, and the king returns to h4. The idea is that when the black queen gives another check on e4, since the pawn on h5 is no longer there, White can advance the pawn to g4 and block the check. And now black has no other possible check except queen e1. But after this, the king can safely advance to h5. From that moment on, there are no more checks against the white king. Botvinnik described this encounter as the game of his life, while this defeat came at the worst possible moment for Capablanca. His health was already declining, his tournament was collapsing with poor results, and that masterpiece by Botvinnik became one of the harshest symbols of the decline of the Cuban genius, who, sadly for the chess world, would pass away only 3 years later. Checkmate against the black king becomes inevitable in just a few moves, and for that very reason, Capablanca decided to resign. I hope you enjoyed it. See you in the next video.